So there's a problem with the title and thesis of this video.
Master Gamgee,
You are a bold one.
Audiences hate bad writing, not strong women, is a bold and confident claim that clearly resonated and continues to resonate with a lot of people, but I'm not sure it's that simple. After all, audiences at large are not critics. After watching any given show or movie, most people do not spend the next hour thinking about how well layered the dialogue was, or how the arc of a given character was laid out to perfection. Instead, they simply turn off the TV and go to bed. The majority of the viewing public simply isn't all that concerned with the technical execution of a given story's writing. If they were, the most popular shows would be ones like Better Call Saul and The Wire, which are masterful creations that feature characters who feel fantastically ordinary and real, and who talk like real people. The complexity and nuance, while the acme of technically good writing, clearly do not by themselves invite an audience's love and admiration. On the flip side, that would suggest that writing full of contrivances and exposition, writing that treats the audience like semi-moronic halfwits instead of functioning adults, is not quite as despised as the title of this video might suggest. And that's because the purpose of writing, of the art it belongs to, is not to be technically sound. Instead, its goal, the goal of all art, is to evoke emotion and provoke thought. Having complexity, depth, and nuance can aid in that purpose, as can ensuring character motivations evolve in a sensible manner, developing character chemistry, and ensuring each scene has narrative weight. That's not to mention the unnecessary exposition, stilted and unnatural dialogue, and general fluff and filler which every writer should seek to avoid at all costs.
But when you lose everything, that's when you're finally free.
If you include the things you are supposed to include and exclude those which you ought to exclude, you will, most likely, end up with a script that at least has a chance at provoking the intended emotions in your audience. So when we look at the various heroines from recent years, we ought to ask, how did the writers want the audience to react to this character? What admirable traits did they give her so we could look up to her example? What difficulties did they have her experience so we could relate to her struggle? How did they bring out her qualities, both good and bad, through her relationship with her fellow characters? And ultimately, did they accomplish what they set out to do? I think one of the biggest failings of modern writing is that screenwriters don't really care about that first question. Instead of writing for their audience, they are writing for themselves.
It's my birthday gift to me. I'm so happy.
Creating a character as some sort of wish fulfillment or cathartic exercise. When you start from such a shallow place, it's going to be nigh on impossible to create a character that is relatable to the masses, that can inspire or edify any given audience member. Even if your writing is technically brilliant, which it never is. If you are writing a character just for you, that heroine will never make any long-lasting positive impact. I could list any number of female leads from the past decade, or even the past 2 years since I made part 1 of the series, whom you have already forgotten about. May and Osha from The Acolyte, whom I only remember because I just watched that series for the purpose of making a couple videos about it. I think everyone forgot about The Marvels before it even came out. And then there's Netflix Katara, whose writers saw all the complexities of the original and thought, nah, we'll make her entire character waterbender.
Recently, it's been coming back to me. I think it's been affecting my bending.
It's incredible how they managed to bungle that arc. Katara was totally flat, lacking her animated predecessor's fiery passion, relentless hopefulness, and unyielding loyalty. Let's talk about real Katara, shall we? Because as much fun as it is to point out all the inane and silly tropes that plague modern heroines, I, for one, would like the storytelling industry to start getting it right again. So let's examine some strong female characters that are actually super well written to help Hollywood and company get back on track. But real quick, let me note that one of the main problems with heroines these days is that they often lean into stereotypes. Male stereotypes. They are confident, tough, tenacious.
Intimidating.
Monsters, Inc., by the way, is an excellent story about relationships mattering more than personal achievements, but that's a topic for another day. Rather than be obscured by these stereotypical qualities, our leading ladies should instead serve as examples of heroic archetypes. It doesn't matter how technically brilliant your writing is, which again it's not. If your character exists mostly to emphasize the strong in strong woman and has a narrow, masculine-centered view on what the word strong means, then you are not going to make your audience feel anything close to informed, inspired, or intrigued. Stereotypes are extremely narrow, but archetypes are broad, allowing characters of great depth and who are vastly different from one another to fit under the same umbrella. Katara, for one, is a wonderful example of the archetype that I have dubbed the Maternal Protector. Exemplars of this archetype will be devoted to the defense and well-being of someone or multiple someones entrusted to her care. She will seamlessly blend ferocity and strength with tenderness and compassion. She will sacrifice willingly and train tirelessly, becoming the best at her chosen art, not for her own gratification, but for the sake of her children. But Katara is not a mother. Well, she is eventually, but we're not talking about The Legend of Korra right now. It is obvious, however, to anyone who has watched Avatar: The Last Airbender that Katara's maternal instinct is quite mature. It has had to be, as she has been forced into responsibilities far beyond what would normally be expected of a 14-year-old due to the war and the loss of her own mother. Rather than crumble under the pressure, Katara rose to the challenge. She essentially raised Sokka 2 years her senior. She encouraged and empathized with Aang when he fought his battle with guilt, and she, eventually, became a trusted counselor and friend to Toph, whose relationship with her own mother was, shall we say, somewhat lacking in warmth. The maternal instinct is one of the most beautiful natural phenomena because it is so pure and self-giving. The maternal protector asks nothing in return for her dedication and sanctuary. She simply wants those under her care to live and flourish, and she is willing to pay a high price for that safety. Sometimes she may even sacrifice herself. Now, fans of the show know that Katara does not die a martyr, but I am instead referring to the episode The Puppet Master, where Katara is taught bloodbending by Hama, a fellow waterbender and Fire Nation prison survivor. Despite her vow never to use the despicable art, Katara is eventually forced into doing just that, enslaving Hama's body in order to force the woman from forcing Sokka's sword through Aang's chest. Katara's decision to break her rule, to go against what she believes to be right and moral in order to save her brother and her friend, is one that weighs heavily on her, especially when Hama cackles triumphantly that Katara has now become a bloodbender. This theme of self-sacrifice, of not merely risking self-preservation, but also giving up one's ideal self in order to protect those under her care, is not unique to Katara. That motif is perhaps most notably present in Sarah Connor, one of the most well-renowned female badasses in cinematic history. Here is a woman who lived a carefree, happy-go-lucky lifestyle before being suddenly thrust into the middle of a war for humanity's very survival against a seemingly unstoppable enemy, being told she was destined to bear and raise mankind's only hope in that struggle, and being forced to fight for that life as well as her own from before John Connor's existence ever began. And then when it did, her job was far from over, as evidenced by, well, the entire second movie, which is where we witness the price she has paid to raise and train John for the war that nobody else believes is going to commence within a few short years. Her insistence on the reality of such a war has landed Sarah in an asylum, where we find her doing her best Uncle Iroh in prison impression, and I'm sorry, I can't let this go unmansplained. You gotta lock your elbows out when you're doing chin-ups, Sarah. Lack of proper pull-up form aside, Ms. Connor is a proper badass. How can you not love this key toss into nightstick to the gut move? I sincerely appreciate it when movies actually make an effort to show how women can overcome men in physical combat, rather than just pitting them against each other on an equal playing field and asking the viewer to suspend disbelief. Terminator 2 really set the standard for this archetype, and few subsequent stories have come close to measuring up to it. Sarah Connor's combination of stoic, unyielding dedication to her mission and tender care for her son is as moving as it is inspiring.
You don't know what it's like to really create something, to create a life. Feel it growing inside you, all you know.
Her desire to give John the peaceful and happy life she was robbed of by whatever violent means are required is not exactly pure, as John himself points out.
Mom! We need to be a little more constructive here, okay?
But it is doubtless relatable to all mothers who might witness this story. What mom wouldn't want to believe herself capable of being able to tell an invulnerable murder robot from the future to go to hell rather than let it get at her child? This is what a maternal protector should be. She should be able to bind together toughness and tenderness, fierceness and warmth, violence and gentleness. Yes, her bond with her child is a vulnerability that can be exploited, but it is also the very thing that makes her the renowned badass she is. People with nothing to lose usually aren't very inspiring to watch. Contrary to what both sides of the political horseshoe, the 4B and Red Pill movements to be more specific, would tell you, relationships do not weaken you. They increase your attack surface, so to speak, but they also urge you to be stronger, braver, and stauncher than you would be if you were alone. When a mother knows her mission from the very beginning, she can be a paragon of strength, courage, and persistence, as Sarah Connor very much is. On the flip side, we have Mother Anastasia from everyone's favorite show, The Acolyte. What's wrong with her, exactly? It's actually kind of hard to say because she's barely a character, despite the fact that her reluctance to let the Jedi even speak to her daughters is a pivotal choice for the show's plot. Her philosophy and ideology remain entirely unexplored. What actually drives this woman other than distrust of the Jedi? Come to think of it, why exactly does she distrust the Jedi? Nobody knows, and you'll never get the chance to ask her because she tried to turn into a cloud of black smoke, disintegrating one of her daughters in the process, and was immediately impaled by a lightsaber. Believe it or not, the show wants you to believe that Master Soul was in the wrong here. Well, maybe they shouldn't have shown Anastasia forcefully dominating the mind of a Jedi Padawan without provocation, and then, I repeat, nearly disintegrating her own daughter if they wanted the audience on her side. Remember, a mark of good writing is that it evokes the intended emotion in the viewer, rather than confusion, annoyance, and general eye-rolling. Mother Anastasia has supposedly been raising these girls for 8 years, and yet her relationship with them is not shown at all beyond what is required for the plot.
Your enemies will not warn you before they attack.
Avatar managed to convey a more meaningful relationship between Katara and Aang before the Airbender even woke up. Returning to that first example of the maternal protector, it's worth noting that she was not consistently formed in her mission as Sarah Connor was. Katara, being quite young, has to deal with the immaturities appropriate to her age, including her anger at her father, whose admittedly necessary absence causes Katara no small amount of grief and angst. She was robbed, you see, of the chance to be an example of our second archetype, the warrior daughter. There are any number of beautifully written characters who fit into this archetype. From Eowyn in the early 2000s, to Ahsoka Tano a decade and change later, to Mael from 2025's Claire Obscure Expedition 33. This archetype is defined by growing maturity, loyalty, coming into one's own, courage often to a fault, and typically a relationship with a strong father figure, such as Theoden, Anakin, and Gustav, respectively. But the character I want to focus on the most for our discussion of this archetype is Gwen Stacy from Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. How the heck does Haley Steinfeld keep getting all the good badass women roles? Someone tell her to share. Anyway, Gwen as Spider-Woman is everything you expect out of a spider-person, or spider-robot, or spider-pig, or whatever. She's brave, she's fearless, she's fast, skilled, and absolutely refuses to stop quipping during a fight.
Oh, look, it's your cousin.
She is also deeply vulnerable. Gwen starts out in a pretty bad place, mentally speaking, in this film, accidentally killing one's own best friend and then losing another best friend because, he lives in a different dimension, isn't exactly beneficial for one's mental health. Her dad's relentless pursuit of Spider-Woman as the suspected killer of Peter Parker doesn't exactly make things better either.
It won't bring him back.
And yet, Gwen does not blame her dad for doing his job, doesn't bear him any ill will for the obviously inescapable misunderstanding. When he asks if she would like a hug, her arms are around him before he can even finish saying the word. Moments like that are so important because they reinforce an idea that has gotten lost in our increasingly individualistic world. We need each other. We are made for relationship. Those relationships will naturally be very different as we progress through the stages of life, but we need support at every step. A teenager such as Gwen Stacy needs a rock to lean on. We see the same theme in Miles' character journey from the same movie. The secrets he has kept from his parents keep him from relying on them like a kid his age ought to, and it takes a serious toll on his psyche. Gwen, mercifully, actually gets some resolution for her own conflict. Well, it is kind of forced upon her when she finds herself on the business end of her dad's service weapon with her web shooters run dry. But then the rest of the movie happens before the two meet again, and Gwen finally has to pour her heart out to her father.
I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm completely on my own. I can't lose one more friend.
From one perspective, Gwen has it all. She's a freaking superhero on an elite strike force that gets to jump between dimensions. She gets to experience new worlds on a daily basis and do work that is of unmistakable importance. But that perspective is shallow and misses out on what actually makes life worth living. If I may offer up one of my all-time favorite quotes. Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art, like the universe itself, for God did not need to create. It has no survival value, rather is one of those things which give value to survival. Take a look at any character arc I've featured on this channel, and you will see that theme reflected over and over again. Iroh does all that he does out of his unquenchable love for Zuko, whose own journey comes full circle when he finally reunites with the uncle who had loved him like his own father refused to. Aragorn seeks the throne of Gondor and Arnor not because he desires power and authority, but because, for one thing, it's simply his duty, but for another, that's the only way he can marry Arwen. The commandos of Delta Squad are motivated by the brotherly bond that they have forged in training and combat. Arthur Morgan fights tirelessly to become a better man because he has taken a gamble that love does in fact exist, and he is determined to show that love by giving to others a life he could never claim as his own. This is what great stories do time and time again. They provide us with unique lenses through which to view universal truths about human nature. So while I can't exactly proclaim Across the Spider-Verse as an all-time great, it is only half a movie after all, it certainly contains those foundational elements that will, I hope, make a story worth watching and rewatching for years to come. As a dad myself, I absolutely love the depiction of Captain Stacy as a man who is willing to sacrifice immeasurably if it means he can love his child the way he ought to. It certainly isn't easy to do so.
Parenting stuff is a big-ass mystery.
But parents, friends, spouses, and anyone who has experienced genuine self-giving love can understand that motivation to simply trust that acting out of love is always the right choice. That is not to say that such a choice guarantees a happy ending, far from it. Eowyn and Ahsoka, two of the aforementioned examples of the warrior daughter, lose their father figure during the course of their stories, albeit in quite different ways. I won't go into much detail for either of those two characters, as I've already made an in-depth analysis of Eowyn's character arc, and am planning to make a similar breakdown for Ahsoka, but I feel some words of praise are warranted here. Ahsoka is obviously a good bit different than Gwen, who actually has a father, and Eowyn, whose uncle raised her from her youth. Being a Jedi, parents aren't really a thing for Ahsoka, so instead she has Anakin. Oh good, that'll end well.
Doing what the Jedi Council says, that's one thing. How we go about doing it, that's another.
But despite her parental figure being a man who himself struggles due to his own father figure being more of an older brother to him, Ahsoka manages to come into her own as a warrior and leader. Oh, it's a bumpy road, don't get me wrong, but that just makes it all the more impressive that she does in fact become a relatively level-headed Jedi with a somewhat firm grip on her emotions, which do admittedly have a tendency to flare up. Again, trained by Anakin, what are you gonna do? And while Ahsoka's eventual departure from the Jedi Order is more important, narratively speaking, for Anakin's arc than for her own, we can still sense her wish that her master had somehow been able to protect her from all this. Whether or not it's Anakin's fault isn't really the point. Failures, even unpredictable and unavoidable ones, weigh heavily upon those who experience them, making them replay the situation over and over again in their minds, using the cursed benefit of hindsight to say, if only I had, time and time again, until they drive themselves insane with regret and remorse. Yet again, the theme of the importance of relationships is present, but now we see it from the other side. The relationship between father and daughter figures broken by tragedy that neither of them could have foreseen and which they were quite powerless to stop. I'm happy Ahsoka's story didn't end there, however. Her triumphant yet depressing victory on Mandalore was a fitting end to the arc of a character all too familiar with inner turmoil and conflict. And yes, I know her story doesn't end there. We'll talk about her arc in Rebels in that later video. In a similar vein, Eowyn's story mercifully does not end on the fields of Pelennor, though if it did, it doubtless would have been a happier ending than Ahsoka's, if the last we saw of the young Jedi was the end of Season 5, anyway. To this point, I have admittedly focused most on the daughter portion of the warrior daughter, but let's not forget the first half of that archetype. Now, Eowyn's attitude toward battle, war, and death isn't totally ideal, but that's part of what makes her character so fantastically relatable.
Take heart, Mary. It will soon be over.
Who wouldn't be tempted to fatalism in the face of seemingly inescapable, inexorable demise? Would you and I not long to be able to rush to meet our quick and glorious end rather than sitting and waiting for an ignoble death to find us? Regardless of motivation, Eowyn's decisions providentially land her here, in between her fallen uncle, the man who has loved, guided, and protected her since she was a young girl, and a beast from some deep abyss of which Rohan's songs would never tell. And yet she does not falter, does not waver, does not blanch in the face of a being so foul and fell it caused the king's guard to flee in terror. The sheer determination and courage displayed there, not to mention the actual skill, are beyond inspiring. Eowyn's stand here represents what all warrior daughters prepare for, even if their fathers hope they'll never have to experience it. Theoden trained Eowyn to ride, to wield sword and shield, and yet he sought to keep her safe, to give her days that were better than his own.
I would have you smile again, not grieve for those whose time has come.
Her disobedience is not so much an act of defiance of proving herself as it is an act of love. Eowyn didn't ride into battle to test her mettle, though she does, but because she could not bear the thought of being apart from those whom she loves in their final moments. If she dies protecting her fallen king, so be it. She doesn't, however. Eowyn eventually marries Faramir and takes up gardening as her main occupation/hobby, which, if you know anything about Tolkien and who he deemed the true hero of The Lord of the Rings, is just about the highest compliment and happiest ending you could hope for. Unfortunately, not all warrior daughters are written so well and exemplify the archetypes so beautifully. Hera from War of the Rohirrim, for example, has a severely underdeveloped relationship with her father. The bones of it are there, but that's pretty much it. Hera's character arc follows a paint-by-numbers approach of free-spirited young woman is held back by everyone else in her life until they eventually realize they shouldn't do that, with no variation or creativity injected into it, and the rest of the story is equally simplistic. It's quite obvious this movie was made purely to keep the rights to the franchise, and a commensurate amount of effort was put into the writing. Helm's character is flattened from his book counterpart, Freyaloth is completely sidelined, and Wolf, the antagonist, is the most predictable, cartoonish villain since Dr. Doofenshmirtz, but he lacks the pharmacist's effortless comedic timing. There is something good here, it's just not really explored much. Helm loves his daughter and Hera loves him back. She fights for the noble and just causes of family and country. If you take this movie at no more than its themes and don't really worry about its execution, I dare say you might quite like it. Unfortunately, the writing is incredibly bland and unimaginative, and Hera's character ends up quite literally where she began.
Wild, some called her. Headstrong, railed her father. Wild, some called her. Headstrong and free.
This, despite the fact that she had to take on the mantle of leadership during the story. What did she do with it at the end? Just kind of cast it aside, because I guess that's canonically what she had to do. Hera, however, is far from the worst example of this archetype done poorly. Oh yes, the Acolyte managed to bungle not one, but two models of the strong female character. The show spends some time on Osha and Sol's relationship. Thanks to Lee Jung-jae's acting ability, we do actually get a sense that he cares for the young girl and wants the best for her. And Osha, for her part, doesn't seem to bear Sol any ill will for her falling out with the Jedi Order. She is, in fact, quite defensive of him right up until the very end when she learns that he killed her mother and immediately unlocks a new force power and chokes him to death. And he lets her because he feels guilty or whatever, even though he definitely saved May's life by stabbing Anastasia before she could vaporize her own daughter. But forget about that, it's cool. Osha has realized that the Jedi are pretty much just as bad as the Sith. Moral equivalency, yay. Osha is a foil to this archetype, not because she is full of flaws or vices, but because she's just not much of anything. Her character is remarkably bland and uninteresting, her motivations unclear, and her loyalties built on the shiftiest of sands. What are we supposed to take away from all this? How are we supposed to feel? If you guessed utter confusion, you are most certainly correct, though that's doubtless not the actual intention. The Acolyte, as I laid out in my last video, has no real moral philosophy. It just wants to overturn the established one, replacing it with an exceedingly murky nothing. Osha as a warrior daughter doesn't fail because her relationship with her father figure ends poorly. Ahsoka's did too, after all. But because this story takes a shell of that archetype and then smashes it to bits without replacing it with anything meaningful. Audiences don't want you to tear stuff down. They want you to build stuff up. That's how your story becomes long-lasting. But that's enough about the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I do have a couple more warrior daughters I wanted to briefly touch on before moving on to our final archetype. The first is an illustration of the point I made in the intro about audiences caring more about how characters make them feel than about the technical aspects of writing. The Fallout show is chock full of contrivances, conveniences, and inconsistencies, but its protagonist is joyful, hopeful, and loyal to her father and her people, so fans generally loved Lucy. Honestly, if anything, the bar for audience acceptance of your female lead is lower than it used to be, simply because we have had so many bad ones. Just don't write them to be obnoxious or preachy or super stereotypically masculine, and you probably have a winner on your hands. For our final example of warrior daughter, I again won't go into detail as this game is relatively new, and I don't want to surprise people with spoilers, but Maelle from Claire Obscure Expedition 33 is a superb example of the warrior daughter. She is determined, courageous, and steadfast in her mission. She would rather embark on a journey that is practically guaranteed to cut her life short by almost a decade because her adopted father/brother is going, and he is practically the only family she has ever known. Maelle is witty, playful, even impudent in her exchanges with Gustav, which goes to show the depth of love that exists between these two. Honestly, this whole game is proof positive that you can write a story featuring several strong female leads and male audiences, gamers are mostly dudes after all, will not mind one bit, so long as you simply do it well. If you craft a story with characters that are believable, likable, and unique, with a story that inspires its audience to think rather than tells them what to think, and that cares more about the experience of the consumer than it does about the whims of the creator, you might just find success, which Expedition 33 absolutely did. Really, the only thing the game lacks is an example of our third archetype, the wise queen. Now, the other two archetypes are not ones I thought of with any particular characters in mind. The Wise Queen, however, yeah, she's Galadriel. Tolkien's elven sovereign is the premier exemplar in fiction of authority wielded with wisdom and prudence, the defining traits of this archetype. The most obvious example of her strength is the challenge she faces at the Mirror of Galadriel, when Frodo freely offers her the One Ring, giving her the chance to assume unspeakable power to rise up and overthrow Sauron and create a new kingdom according to her own desire. Yes, it turns out that true strength is sometimes best shown by rejecting power. Obviously, Tolkien did not believe all power to be evil. Many of his heroes are kings and queens and lords and captains after all. But taking shortcuts to power, grabbing a hold of the One Ring as an easy way to fulfill one's wishes would not be a wise choice, to say the least. Power does corrupt, but only when it is seized, rather than being carefully cultivated. Galadriel knows this.
I pass the test. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel.
We hear a similar sentiment echoed later in the story by Sam Gamgee after the ring tempts him with a vision of all of Mordor become one massive garden. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due. I could go on at length about the value of peaceful contentedness, but instead, I will simply say, this incredible woman who has lived thousands of years and possesses all the wisdom you'd think would accompany such a lifetime, has learned her limits and understands her place, and she accepts them. In that humility, we find true greatness. Now, to be sure, Galadriel is an immensely powerful being. Her magic is what keeps the woods of Lothlorien safe from ravaging orcs. The file she gives Frodo proves to be highly effective against Shelob, the spawn of Ungoliant, who, along with Melkor, destroyed the trees of Valinor. You could say this moment is the trees getting their revenge in a small way. But more powerful still is Galadriel's ability to look into the hearts of those whom she meets and offer them the wisdom, comfort, and compassion that they need. There's a passage in the book where Celeborn learns that the dwarves had awoken the Balrog within Moria and rather tersely states his regret at letting the Fellowship enter his land, even going so far as to suggest that Gandalf was foolish to lead them into Moria. "It would be rash indeed that said that thing," said Galadriel gravely. "Needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf in life. Those that followed him knew not his mind and cannot report his full purpose. But however it may be with the guides, the followers are blameless. Do not repent of your welcome to the dwarf. If our folk had been exiled long and far from Lothlorien, who of the Galadrim, even Celeborn the Wise, would pass nigh and would not wish to look upon their ancient home, though it had become an abode of dragons? Dark is the water of Kelidzarum, and cold are the springs of Kibelnala, and fair were the many-pillared halls of Khazad-dûm in elder days, before the fall of mighty kings beneath the stone." She looked upon Gimli, who sat glowering and sad, and she smiled. And the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes. And it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw their love and understanding. Wonder came into his face, and then he smiled in answer. Note how Galadriel's compassion and sympathy for Gimli and her complete trust in the judgment of Gandalf enabled her wisdom to rise above that of her husband, whose sole focus at that moment was simply the safety of their realm. What a beautiful way to show how the two sexes necessarily complement one another. A similar duo, in a fashion, comes from an entirely different genre and medium. Link and Zelda, specifically from the Breath of the Wild, because that's the only Zelda game I've played, and please don't get mad at me, my family only ever had a computer growing up, so I played Backyard Baseball and Roller Coaster Tycoon instead of Majora's Mask and Super Mario Bros., okay? And yes, I know Tears of the Kingdom exists, but it's like a million hours long, and I've got a job, a wife, a dog, 4 kids, a YouTube channel, and honestly, at this point, I'm probably just waiting until my oldest is old enough to play it with me. Anyway, I admit that Princess Zelda, at least in this game, is a bit of an odd choice, as the most we see of her is in Link's rediscovered memories, in which she struggles greatly with the weight of responsibility that's been placed on her and her own inability to gain the power she is supposed to hold, the power that will keep her kingdom from being torn apart. And despite her best efforts, Zelda does fail.
It's all my fault. Our only hope for defeating Ganon is lost. All because I couldn't harness this cursed power.
That is until the moment when there truly is no other hope.
No!
Zelda had no reason to believe that the power which had eluded her would suddenly make its appearance at that moment. After all, she had been trying with all her might and willpower to make it manifest within her, as it had for her mother and grandmother before her. You could come up with any number of theories for why it refused to awaken before and why it did now, but the simplest one is that she finally truly needed it. And more importantly, that she was willing to stand in between Link and certain death without that power. And who you are without power says a great deal about who you will be with power. It is at this moment that Zelda comes into her own, that she begins to embody the archetype of the wise queen. A good ruler, after all, sacrifices for her people. Zelda's first queenly act was one of willing sacrifice, and her next is of the same makeup, sealing Ganon away in Hyrule Castle until Link's reawakening. We aren't treated too much insight as to what those 100 years were like for the princess. Well, I guess she is the queen now, both literally and figuratively, but doubtless they were not pleasant ones. We hear the dreadful weariness and weakness in her voice from the very start of the game, but they are always accompanied by firm resolution and resolve. She will hold on, she will persist until the moment of Link's return. Ultimately, I think Zelda serves as a great second example of the Wise Queen, specifically because she is so different from Galadriel. Rather than beginning the story as the enlightened sage, she is forced to come into her own through learning, struggle, and failure. I don't doubt that she fleshes out her example of this archetype in the next game, but I'll talk about that in due time, I guess. Another counter-example to Galadriel, but a foil in this case, comes from allegedly the same fictional universe, Queen Regent Muriel in the Rings of Power. Given her position, she should be leading her people with wisdom, vision, and prudence, but she shows precious little of any of these qualities. Instead, she just has visions of Numenor's downfall, and then does a 180 regarding Timu Galadriel and her requested army because a tree starts shedding some leaves. Literally anybody could follow signs and omens. There's nothing special about Muriel. In a similar vein, it's hard for me to emphasize just how little impact Master... What was her name again? Ro? Really? Her last name is half the sound Scooby-Doo makes when he's surprised? Now, maybe she's not really supposed to be an example of a wise queen, but she should. She's a high-ranking master within the Jedi Order, and she's over 100 years old. She absolutely should embody wisdom, justice, and clarity. Instead, her main purpose is to move the nonsensical Jedi cover-up plot point forward. Yes, my friends, the Acolyte really managed to go 3 for 3 in providing instances of how not to write these archetypes. I wasn't even originally planning to include it in this video, but I figured I ought to do my research for May and Osha and the Warrior Daughter, and lo and behold, it presented me with 2 other counter examples on a Beskar platter. I don't have much else to say about Master Rutro because there's just... Again, not much there. Her entire motivation is to keep the Jedi safe from prying eyes in the Senate, because that's a thing that exists but is never explored aside from one scene with one senator who doesn't think the Jedi's stoic ways are possible. Rutro, like the rest of the characters in that show, exists because the writers wanted to make the Jedi out to be just as corrupt and morally compromised as everyone else.
I've accepted my darkness. What have you done with yours?
None of them feel like real people, but rather like bullets in a PowerPoint presentation on why the Jedi are bad, actually. The whole goal of that show is to subvert and undermine what came before it, and thus to upset and annoy the audience who is rightly attached to the honorable ideals of the Jedi Order. And that's just not what art is supposed to do. I'm not saying that art should never evoke negative emotions. Plenty of examples that I listed here do just that. Most, if not all, of the warrior daughters experience tragedy and loss, and we suffer with them. The maternal protectors have to give so much of themselves, and the audience feels their pain and their longing for what could have been. The wise queens are burdened by responsibility, and their struggle radiates through the screen and into our hearts. But despite all of that, they manage to be uplifting, edifying, and inspiring. Well-told stories about loss and sorrow can help us cope with our own grief, assuring us that we are not alone in our experience, that this too shall pass. The well-written, strong women that we see in story after story are not concerned with tearing down stereotypes, but in building up their own unique take on a given archetype. And I love that the 3 archetypes I have laid out here represent these stages of a woman's life. She begins in adolescence, probably, as someone who wants to do good within the world, who is willing to fight and sacrifice for her noble cause, and who relies on a parent for support and guidance. When she becomes a mother, her worldview shifts. Her principles and ideals are still likely intact, and her mission may be as well, but her energy is naturally more devoted to those who rely entirely on her. And once those children are self-sufficient, she may then become a matriarch, a woman whose experience has brought wisdom that will be passed down from generation to generation. So Hollywood, there you have it. Audiences have nothing against powerful women on screen. They just don't really like how they've been treated lately. They don't like feeling coerced into rooting for the strong female lead who evokes boredom and mild annoyance if her writing manages to elicit any emotion at all. I'd like to say that this problem has gotten better in the past couple of years since I made the first iteration of this series, but I'm not sure that it has. I mean, Ironheart exists, so yeah. Perhaps they'll get their act together at some point, but I'm not holding my breath. In the meantime, if you want good stories featuring strong women, maybe expand your horizons a bit. Play a AA video game. Watch a low-budget animated movie. She's clearly a female robot, okay? Or maybe even read a book. I've been reading Shogun, and while it's obviously mostly about dudes, the way the main female character cleverly navigates this world where she is forced to be subservient and obedient to the men in her life is quite fascinating. As it turns out, there are far more and better ways to show off your strong female lead than to make her the embodiment of male action hero stereotypes, because there's really nothing special about that. Now, to be fair, most of the foils I have talked about in this video are not that, but they are equally shallow and lame. They avoid one girl boss trope and then fall into a more general one. They lack depth, consistency, and meaningful relationships with their fellow characters. They might not make us feel annoyed or accused as the female leads of 5 years ago did, but that's simply because they fail to make us feel anything at all. But there is something special, something unique, something unrepeatable about the women I've talked about in this video. They may be built from the same frameworks, but the creativity and love that are poured into their designs, their motivations, their every decision and sacrifice are what make them well written, are what make them truly unforgettable. So, there you have it, the long-awaited part 2 to the video whose script I wrote in the car on the way home from a family vacation. Good times. This was quite a bit different in tone than the last one, intentionally so. I'm sure I could spend half an hour or more pointing out all the flaws in the female leads from the past 2 years, but I find it's more worthwhile to instead show how to write women well. I'm not against criticism, obviously, but I find positivity to be far more enduring than negativity. If you want to support this channel's mission of sharing the love and appreciation for the tales that really matter, please consider joining my Patreon. The link is in the description. Plus, you'll get some behind-the-scenes stuff, random unscripted videos, and the ability to vote in polls for future videos. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. God bless, and I will see you in the next one.